Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and here I am at the grave of Michael Collins in Glasnevin Cemetery, Dublin. Anyway, Republicans often have the temerity to tell me that people like Collins fought for my freedom, as though we weren't free already. And I point out that obviously we became less free after we left the United Kingdom. Our rights were reduced. We're deprived of certain rights, no longer allowed to get divorced, no longer allowed to use contraception. Our freedom of expression was limited. There was already censorship. It was the 1920s, even in the UK, but it became more severe within the new Irish state about what you could publish in newspapers and books, about what you could perform on stage and things like that. So we'd been a secular state prior to 1922, 1937 Constitution. We actually had a state religion. Catholicism became the state religion. So it was reducing our rights, not increasing them. So we had less liberty after separation than we did before. But on to Collins. Well, the other thing is, people come here to pay homage to him. They lay wreaths to him and so forth. Fine, I'm not objecting to that. They have the right to do so. But therefore, I also have the right to come here and excoriate him. And you might say, well, how would you feel if I went to the grave of someone you admire and I was lambasting them? Well, it wouldn't bother me. Please, go ahead, do it. Go knock yourself out. Now, I could argue back and explain why I don't share your view, but I would not take issue with your right to do so. You have the absolute right to say whatever you want, wherever you want, including at someone's graveside. So I'm not desecrating the grave. I don't believe in injuring gravestones. That's beneath disdain. Anyway, as you can see, Irish tricolours there and a couple of old glories. Not that the United States officially did anything for his cause at that time. Remember, President Wilson said Ireland's part of the United Kingdom. Ireland's future is a British matter. That's internal. Anyway, there were individual Americans, quite a few of them, who often knew nothing about Ireland or what's changed, but threw their weight behind this most chauvinistic expression of Irish identity. I think to be pro-Ireland, you've got to be anti-England. But anyway, Collins was born at Sam's Cross in County Cork. So his father was a very old father and had been an adult at the time of the famine. And Collins was the youngest of several children. His mother was much younger than his father. And when he was a little boy, his father passed away. So Collins left school at 16 and he joined the post office. He moved to London where he worked there. He eventually became a stockbroker who's doing quite well. So he was sworn into the Irish Republican Brotherhood and in the Gaelic Athletic Association. In case you don't know, that's about Gaelic games, hurling and Gaelic football. It's our unique form of football. It's not like association football. There was a debate, should they ban members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, that's the police, or the British Armed Forces from joining, or those who drew pensions therefrom. And some people in the GA said, we're just about sport, and that's it, and we're broad-minded. But oh no, he was one of the bigots. He was very intolerant, said members of the Crown Forces and those who draw pensions from this are never allowed to join. And that rule was extant until about 20 years ago, because the GAA, founded in 1884, partly under the patronage of Archbishop Croke. That's why Croke Park, a couple of miles from here, the GAA's main stadium, is named in his honour. If you look on the GA's website, it says in 1887 it was taken over by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, this shadowy underground organisation which wanted to foment bloody revolution and break us away from the United Kingdom. So now, the GA, just for the love of the game, fine. Some of them had a more national agenda, said speak Irish as much as possible, Irish food and drink, if we have any dances, got to be Irish dancing and so on, and you can't be playing garrison sports. Play our games, you can't play any football, rugby, cricket, anything like that, because they just were really Anglophobic and xenophobic, just rejecting the culture of our neighbour and, international culture as it soon became. They eventually dropped that one. They couldn't be too categorical about it. Anyway, so then he wanted to help start a conflict in Ireland. Well, he got his wish. He resigned his job in early 1916 and returned to Ireland with a view to taking part in this insurrection. Was at the offing, and then he participated in the Easter Rising, was fairly high up in it. He told his employers he was off to join an Irish regiment, which in his mind was true, which was the Irish Volunteers. I think he'd been working for County Markovich before that. He was in the GPO. He was very close to Joseph Mary Plunkett, this 26-year-old who's dying of tuberculosis. So Plunkett's one of those who was executed in the days afterwards. Now, if Plunkett hadn't been part of the rising, if he just died, we never would have heard of him. So I'm very anti-Republican. I've got to say, well, is it better to go down in history dying for a cause you believe in, even though this one I think is filthy, than just dying of an illness? So Plunkett was allowed to get married minutes before he was executed at the stone-breaking yard in Kilmainham jail to Grace Gifford, his Protestant fiancée. He hadn't managed to fit it in the week before the rising when he was hurried. And then his bride was taken away. She never re-wed. He was executed minutes later. Well, people say, oh, well, isn't that a tragical tale? Well, actually, isn't it very reasonable of the authorities to let them get married? Because they said, no, sorry, you're in prison, not allowed to get married. People weren't. Tough. Should have thought about that before you unleash this bloodbath, which over 100 years later is not over for some people. I saw the poster the other day saying, 1916 is unfinished business. There are a few headbangers who want to start shooting again. I don't. Anyway, so that was the end of him. And there's a song about that, Grace. So a lot of the young men who would have been killed in that rising, they would have been engaged too, and they never got married because of him. Anyway, so that was so Collins. He was then sent to Fronghoff in Great Britain, that internment camp, where they treated very leniently. And then I think it was Nottingham prison. After a while, he was released. He came back. He became very high up in the IRA, director of intelligence, director of finance. He had a head for figures, and started to start the revolt in January 1919. Seen as a hardliner, he was chairman of the Supreme Council of Fenians. That was also known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And I won't tell you everything, but his reputation really grew, partly when Eamon de Valera went to the United States. He helped bring him out of Strangeways jail in Manchester. De Valera was an American citizen, went back to the US to raise funds and publicity, quite successful at that, so Collins' stock rose. There appears to be some animus between the men. Is it ideological? Is it a personality clash, some sort of rival? The big fellow, as Collins was known, versus the long fellow, that's de Valera, because de Valera was notoriously lanky. Anyway, then the truce in July 1921, and Collins was sent to negotiate in London most of the time. Why did de Valera visit it at least once? Why on earth did de Valera not do it himself? People say, well, maybe he knew he couldn't deliver the deal. So he was seen as so obdurate, Collins, but then he signed off this agreement on the 6th of December 1921, writing hours later saying, will anyone accept it? Will anyone? I've signed my own death warrant. But maybe he meant metaphorically. He said, I'm getting Ireland what Ireland's wanted for centuries. Well, Ireland hasn't wanted that for centuries. The idea of a republic was only around since the 1790s. It was very much a minority thing. And in the 17th century, very few people even thought of breaking our connection with Great Britain. It was just was taken as read. Of course we'd share the same king as our neighbour. We're not a parliamentary union. Anyhow, so he had a very warped and selective view of our history. There was some curious amnesia going on there. But anyway, so then the Civil War broke out because there was a split. So the new Irish Free State was set up, and the Irish Army was formed, 2/3 of whom were former soldiers of the British Army. Irishmen had served in the British Army. And then some IRA men said, no, we won't accept this treaty. Dáil Éireann, that's our parliament, voted on it, and by 64 votes to 57 accepted it. Bear in mind, Dáil Éireann was sort of a one-party state. Every single member of Dáil Éireann that voted on it in January 1922 was a member of Sinn Féin, because the election to the House of Commons of Southern Ireland, as it was called, was uncontested. 128 seats, every single one was elected unopposed, because the IRA's reign of terror was that effective. Nobody dared stand against them. It'd be the death of you. You'd be killed if you stood anything else. Now, admittedly, Labour, I think, was just standing aside partly because they're somewhat sympathetic, but then they knew they'd be crushed anyway if they stood against them. I mean, crushed in terms of votes. But anyway, so that was that. It had been signed, it had been ratified. Even Sinn Féin had ratified it by a narrow majority. Then an election held in 1922 in Southern Ireland. 75% of the votes for pro-treaty candidates. In the north, obviously, most people are unionists. They accepted it because the 6 counties were staying where they were. And the Northern Ireland Labour Party accepted it. The Nationalist Party there, maybe not so happy. But anyway, so then Sir Henry Wilson, who was one of the most distinguished Irishmen of the age, he was assassinated on his doorstep in Belgravia, London, by Reginald Dunn and what's his name? Is it James O'Sullivan? Collins had ordered this guy to be killed some time before, had not countermanded his earlier order, I think. I don't think he wanted to go ahead in June 1922. And the UK government said, no, come on. This is it. We can't have this. You've got to close down the IRA, because the IRA, I suppose the Irish Army had taken over lots of buildings in Dublin and Cork and Limerick and so on, taken over the forecourts. So, and they'd also kidnapped J.J. Ginger O'Connell, an officer in the Free State Army. So then ultimatum went out that the IRA and the Four Courts had to surrender or fire be opened. Remember, the British Army had evacuated most of its bases in Southern Ireland, handed them over to the fledgling Irish Army, and so artillery was lent by the British Army, and fire was opened on the Four Courts, which surrendered after a few days. But something was blown up deliberately or accidentally in the Four Courts is not clear, but many of our historical records were destroyed, and thanks to that, that's the IRA destroying our history and heritage, just typical. But they surrendered, and there was the Battle of Dublin going on for about a week. Eventually, the Free State Army, that's the Irish Army, prevailed. But anyway, so there was an amphibious assault on Cork and things like that. So Cork City was taken. There was still a lot of irregular activity. The IRA, something called the Irregular. So he drove to, I think it was Skibbereen, and despite being on duty and in uniform, he had a few pints, which was an outrageous example, as said to his men. You don't drink on duty. People often castigate the Royal Irish Constabulary Special Reserve, that's commonly called the Black and Tans, for drinking on duty. I don't know if that's true, but there's the allegation that they drank on duty. It might be true. It would be disgraceful if they did, but you don't do that. Breach of discipline, but also if you have to fight, your reactions are slower, you can't aim properly, you're mal-coordinated, so you can't have people getting blind drunk on duty. And what kind of example was he setting to his men? He's supposed to be a general, and so he screwed up. If he hadn't spent so much time there, he probably would have been ambushed. And that 22nd of August 1922, they were driving back, and at Bale-na-Blore, the mouth of the Flowers, that valley, they were ambushed by the IRA. Were the IRA specifically there to meet them? People said that peace feelers were put out. There was going to be some sort of secret parley with De Valera, who rejoined the IRA as a volunteer. Was Collins lured to his death? I don't think so, but some people think so. Anyway, I believe in the sort of cock-up more than conspiracy theory of this. The IRA shot the Free State Army. The Free State Army shot the IRA. You know, that's to be expected. If they manage to kill a general, well, that's, at 10 points for the IRA. They consider that a real scalp. So the IRA ambush party being in that ambuscade all day, they were just about to withdraw. Then they saw this column come through. So an armoured car, a motorcyclist, and I don't know who else. And the IRA had put something on the road, some sort of obstacle, a hay cart or whatever. So as in the Free State Army have to get out of the car to shift it, whether you get shot. And they could have sped on, but Collins said, no, stop, we'll fight them. Which, well, he paid with his life for that. And he was shot in the head very quickly. Fatally, one of his guys was wounded in the hand. I think those are the only two people who got hit. It's probably Sonny O'Neill was the one who shot him. We're not sure. He died in the 1950s, and the IRA soon withdrew. So Collins was probably killed instantaneously, but the IRA had blown up some bridges, so they drove back to Cork City. They were ambushed quite late in the evening, about 8 in the evening, just before dusk. And so from there to Cork City would only take an hour's drive nowadays. The bad roads those days might have taken a couple of hours. But because so many bridges were down, they had to take a circuitous route. They didn't get back to the wee hours. He's taken to the Shanacheel Hospital but pronounced dead. You can see a photo of his bandaged head and his stone-cold hands holding a crucifix. That's him. Arthur Griffith had died 10 days earlier from exhaustion, and Collins had given some sort of oration for him. Collins' namesake, another Michael Collins, had been killed, a Free State Army soldier, and in one of his notes he wrote, Michael Collins shot, which was curiously prophetic. Anyone who was brought here had a splendid state funeral down O'Connell Street and laid to rest here. I remember it being quite a modest grave, or maybe I'm thinking of De Valera's grave somewhere down there. I've seen a photo of his brother here decades later with a grave digger. I'm not sure why they were tending it. So you can go to Bale-na-Blore every 22nd of August. It's a bit of a shindig for Fine Gael. To pay tribute to this man who died, who was, chairman of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State. So many people regard that as Taoiseach, although the title Taoiseach didn't exist at the time. And that's him who was 32 when he died. They were very young men. In a revolutionary period, it's easier to advance quickly because the old people are getting killed, people are leaving the country or whatever, and it tends to promote young people fast, and then he was one of them. They were often very young men in their 20s or early 30s who rose to prominence at that time. There's all sorts of speculation about what he would have done. He admired Denmark, a small agricultural country, a little bit similar to Ireland, so that is an economic model for us. It didn't come to pass, but then he was somehow almost seduced by the British Empire during the negotiations. David Lloyd George had said, come here, put his hand around Michael and showed a map of the British Empire, saying, why do you come in with us, help us run this. And so Sean McBride, That guy had grown up in Paris, son of John McBride, who was executed in 1916. He was only about 18 years old, Sean McBride, when he witnessed this. He said, I could tell it had a profound influence on Michael. And Sean McBride, he was travelling back and forth between London and Dublin, delivering mails every weekend. And Collins didn't know if the negotiations were going to break down in London in 1921 and kept a plane at Croydon Airport in case he needed to make a quick getaway. People said he signed under threat of war, but everybody knows that. That's the default setting. You could say the UK government signed under threat of war. If the negotiations fail, the conflict resumes. That's no mystery. That's not new. Anyway, so it doesn't vitiate the agreement any more than the Crown could say, oh, well, that treaty doesn't count because we only signed it because you're using violence. No, it does count. I mean, by this rationale, no peace treaty would ever be valid because they're always signed under threat. Anyway, so that is the end of Michael Collins. People said he would have been a military dictator or something like that. That's what his foes said. Cumann na Gael was founded, later became Fine Gael because it merged with the Army Comrades Association, commonly called the Blue Shirts, this fascist group, although it's now one of the most liberal parties, a very Europhile party. If he'd lived, would he have been a dictator in the 1930s? We really can't tell. So that's him. So he's someone that I don't have much time for. Got to say, I truly despise. You can see various coins there, 5-cent coins. Well, that's all he's worth. 30 pieces of silver, I would have said. Who betrayed everything he ever served, well, betrayed the United Kingdom, which he was fortunate to be a citizen, one of the most humane, advanced, freest and wealthiest countries in the world. Obviously had its faults. Then he was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, betrayed that by signing the treaty, and obviously turned his guns on his former comrades, betrayed the peace treaty signed with the UK by sending guns to the north to engage in a sectarian bloodbath in 1922. It's true that some loyalists were committing bestial attacks on the Catholic civilian population, but he was still breaking the agreement and still fueling the flames. Well, that is Collins. I don't miss him. You may have seen the biopic. So I think his reputation is very much overblown. He was right in 1922. That being the situation in 22, he was right to fight for the Free State against the IRA. But he thought that maybe the boundary commission that was set up as part of the Treaty of 1921 would lead to major cessions of territory from the north. Well, it did report and was going to have a border revision and give about 2% of Northern Ireland's territory net to the south, but both sides said, well, we won't do it because Southern Ireland were almost financially failing. We'd taken on some of the UK's debt, and in return for being absolved of paying that debt, we said we won't take any of the territory to the north. So even when we could have a bit of the territory, we said no to it. This is so often forgotten. I mean, there's this racist thing, perfidious Albion people to say about the English. Now, they could say perfidious Hibernia about us. Now, we're not all guilty or mostly guilty of perfidy, but republicanism certainly is, to some extent, nationalism. And yes, unionism deserves to be criticised too. So yes, I am a unionist, but an idiosyncratic one. I'm not responsible for what any other unionist has done. I'm only responsible for my own views, just like you might be a nationalist. All right, you're not responsible for nationalism at all. You might not endorse everything that's ever been said or done. It'd be strange if you did. Anyway, that's my penny's worth on Michael Collins. So please keep your donations coming. I really need them for this channel. And you can see the names of various soldiers of the Free State Army who were killed in the cause of democracy in 1922, 22nd of June. It started 1922, the Civil War. That's Midsummer's Day. On to the Dump Arms Order in 1923, when Eamon de Valera and Frank Aiken, the IRA Chief of Staff, said to cease conflict. De Valera's message was soldiers of the Republic, Legion of the Rear Guard, dump arms, as in just bury them or whatever. The Republic can no longer be successfully defended, of course, and there were some hardliners, uncompromising IRA men who wanted to carry on even still, and even into the mid-20s there were occasional attacks on the Irish Army, on the British Army, such as Smike Island, some of them machine gunned to death. Even the Garda Síochána, the new police, the unarmed police, the civic guards we call them because they didn't carry weapons, as opposed to the RIC. So please keep your donations coming and do online lessons with me in history and politics, in religious studies, geography, French, law, and so on. Thank you. Goodbye.